Okay, ladies and gents, so we've done all the prep work. So we've done our quilt as you go. We've made our zipper and we've added the zipper tab on the end. We've cut our lining pieces. Now, there may be some questions about why the lining pieces are a different shape to the exterior pieces, and that's because I don't like baggy linings very much. And if you make your exterior pieces and lining pieces the exact same size, it's physics. The same size will not fit into this exterior because this exterior is now has got some thickness to it. So the inside of that is going to be, that's 2mm. So if you've got it on both sides, it's going to be 4mm smaller on all sides. And that's the reason we cut our lining pieces smaller, so that our lining fits snugly rather than being baggy inside. Now, I know there are a lot of people that are great believers of the got a bit of extra fabric on here, just increase the seam allowance technique of making your linings a little snugger. For me, that's just, how much do you increase the seam allowance by? Are you going to sew your lining 4 times before you get the right seam allowance? If you make it too big, are you going to unpick it all? It's easier just to have the lining pieces made smaller so that they do fit. So that's what I do. So you will have 2 lining pieces, both of which will be interfaced hopefully with a woven fusible interfacing. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with woven fusible interfacing, doesn't look like you're going to be familiar with it either, because I don't appear to have any here. If I do, woven fusible interfacing, and this is a Vilene product, it's like cloth. It's woven like cloth. It scrunches up small and it feels like cloth. The back of it is rough because it's got little glue bubbles on it, but I don't know if you can actually see that, but it's actually woven. It's got a warp and a weft. I think you probably can, in much the same way as your cotton fabric that you've been using for, let's just turn the light on, for your quilting has got a warp and a weft. It gives the fabric stability and longevity without making it stiff and boardy. Now, if you use non-woven interfacing, and you can use non-woven interfacing if you really haven't got woven interfacing, I would suggest a very light non-woven interfacing. The heavy stuff that's like paper or card will make it nice and smooth to start with, but once you've turned your pouch out, you'll end up with a really wrinkly inside and you'll be really disappointed with it. If your lining fabric is just a touch thicker, I would actually probably go without any interfacing at all, rather than use that very thick papery stuff. I'm just going to plug the phone in here because I don't want it to die on me, so I'm sorry if I make you wobbly a bit. So you'll have 2 lining panels and your 2 exterior panels, and I've done mine differently. I've got one that's got the multi round and round in circles, and the other one has the stripes, because I can and because you can as well. So I'm going to show you this version first. So this is the short version, and the technique is exactly the same really for all of them. So I'm going to use, let's just get those out of the way. I'm going to take the front panel, the front exterior panel. I'm going to take my zipper that I've prepared, and I've still got the clips on the end, and I'm going to lay my zipper centrally along the top of my panel with the zipper pull facing downwards, so the zipper is right sides down, and you're going to have approximately 3/4 of an inch on either end. Now you can either pin or clip it in place, and I'm using a number 5 zipper on this one because this is a bigger pouch and I just like a slightly bigger zipper. You can, however, use a number 3 if that's what you've got, so don't feel that you've got to go out and buy zippers. So I'm just going to clip the zipper. I'm just going to pull that zipper pull out the way along the top. Normally I've got zipper pulls all over, clips all over my table. I must have put them away last night, but I appear to have put all the big ones on the top, and I don't want big ones. So make sure that it sits an equal distance. It should be about 3/4 of an inch this end and the same this end from that sort of 90-degree corner that you had. And once you've got it in place and sitting nicely and you're happy with it, if it makes you feel more comfortable, fold your zipper in half, fold this panel in half and mark those two pieces and kind of clip from the centre outwards. I just tend to pretty much eyeball things, to be honest. And we're going to stitch this zipper in place using a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. We're just going to stitch along the side of the zipper to attach it to our exterior panel. The one thing I will say is what I've done before I did this was I pressed the zipper, just the zipper tape. And I'm coming down to the point where that zipper pull is. Now before I get to that zipper pull, I'm going to keep my needle in, raise my foot, and I'm just going to pull that zipper pull so that it's the other side of my foot. If you don't, as your foot goes past it, you'll get a wobble in your stitching, and it will look awful. And you're just going over that zipper tab, a couple of black stitches, just to secure your stitching. So you can see I've stitched all the way along. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim off the excess zipper teeth that you had kind of sticking upwards. So I've just trimmed off so that it's level with the top part of my bag. I'm just going to open my zipper up again because I find it easier just to keep that out of the way. I'm going to take one of my lining pieces and I'm going to lay it right sides together so that it sits directly over the top of the exterior fabric, and I'm just going to clip it all the way along, making sure that those top edges match perfectly. And you're effectively making a zipper sandwich here. So your zipper is sandwiched between the lining and the exterior panels. And the top edge of your lining should be exactly the same width as your exterior panel. But you can see as you go down the sides, there's a little bit of exterior panel showing, and that's how it should be. So now we're going to come back and we are going to stitch all the way across the top of this panel. Now if you're using a number 5 zipper for this, then your seam allowance can be should be 3/8 of an inch. If you're using a number 3 zipper, then your seam allowance here should be 1/4 of an inch. It makes a fraction of a difference to the height of the finished pouch, but not enough of a difference to make a vast amount of a noticeable change. Now I don't tend to use my zipper foot because I just don't. So you're now just stitching those two panels together with the zipper in the middle. And I've just hit a kink there. I actually am going to put my narrower foot on because that's for some reason isn't liking it today. I don't usually change my foot often. So let me just find my narrower foot. She says with great confidence. Actually, I'm going to stick that one on. That's actually a Teflon. That's the wrong side. Teflon zipper foot. And I'm just going to go across that stitching because I seem to have gone a bit wonky, which does happen. That's better. just going to get rid of these bobbles off my top, otherwise I know I'm going to end up sewing them into the zipper. I'm just removing the clips as I go. As I get down to this end, my zipper pull is tucked away under there, so I'm just going to leave the needle in, raise the foot, go underneath, and let me just, if I can lift that up and show you, and I'm just going to pull my zipper pull so that it's behind my foot, my stitch, my presser foot, because I don't want a bubble, a bump in my stitching. And I'm coming across and going straight over the top of the zipper tab that I've got there. Now what I can do is I can open that up and look at that. Doesn't that look fab? Now I'm just going to grab my ironing pad. Now what I like to do with this, because we've got foam in the seam allowance, is I like to just trim away a little bit, if I can, of that quilt as you go. I'm just literally taking 1/8 of an inch out, and it's just to take the bulk away from the side of that zipper. And it's only the exterior panel that I'm trimming that little bit off. And it's just 1/8 of an inch, but it's just enough to be able to top stitch effectively without having too much bulk. Because certainly on this particular version, where you've got all the layers overlapping each other, it can be quite thick at the top here. It's less so if you're doing stripes. I just find taking that little bit of bulk out from the top, and you can see that is literally just 1/8 of an inch from the top. And when you look at it, you can see that you can just see the zipper tape poking out above, which is exactly how I want it to be. So I'm going to turn my lining behind my exterior panel, and I'm going to push that lining down so that it's sitting right behind the zipper. Now, I tend to not press this an awful lot, because Quilt As You Go you want it to be relatively puffy. If you start really pressing it hard, you'll find that it goes a bit flat and looks a bit one-dimensional, and that's the whole point of this, is that it looks more than that. So use your fingers and just kind of roll those two seams, the front seam and the rear seam. I'm just going to open that zipper up a bit more. Give them a little roll and pop a clip in, or a pin if it suits you. So to pin the two pieces together, make sure that the two seams are pushed as far as they can go. Now, in some pouch patterns, it tells you only to top stitch the exterior fabric. I've tried that, and I don't really like the finish of it. I like where the lining is tucked inside of the bag. If you feel that you want to, you can press on the inside. If you feel you want to, you can press on the outside, but I just don't like to, because I just think it flattens everything. Now, let's change back to the other foot. We're going to top stitch along the top of our pouch, but we're not going right from one side to the other. We're going to go from where the zipper tab is. So on this side, we're going to go from where the zipper starts all the way along to where the zipper tab finishes. Now I'm going to have long threads on my machine at the start. And I'm not going to back stitch. Now, that first stitch, if you're going straight through the zipper teeth, you may find you need to just hand crank it. And I'm going to top stitch along the edge of my zipper 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. Go slowly. Because this is bulky, it's probably bulkier than you might normally have when you're making bags or pouches, and that's because of the Quilt As You Go. Because you can't trim the foam from the seam allowance if you're using foam, you have got quite a lot of bulk, so Just take it slowly. Your machine will go through. I have a size 16 needle in here. When you get down to where that zipper pull is, then needle in, raise the foot, move the zipper pull out of the way. And you're just going to stitch to the end of the zipper tab. Raise your foot, raise your needle, leaving long threads like that. Now we're going to take our self-threading needle. Any needle will do. I like self-threading ones. And I'm just going to pop that thread from the front through to the back, through the last hole, so there's no obvious start and there's no obvious sort of back stitching. I'm going to do the same at the other end. It's quite tough because that's where the zipper teeth are, so you might have to give it a bit of a wiggle. It will go through. Turn it over. Tie off your threads. Now you can just trim off those ends if you want to. I prefer to bury them into my lining. So I'm going to take those two threads and I'm going to go back into the lining fabric at the point more or less where I finished my stitching, where that little knot is. I'm just going to take my needle through. Keeps opening, keeps closing up. My needle through to between the lining and the foam or the fleece or whatever you've used, and bring both of those threads through there. Now I can trim them off and they are going nowhere, and that gives you, there's no obvious finish either. There's no back stitching on either the front or the back. I'm going to do exactly the same at the other end. So first things first, just do a couple of small knots, then use my self-threading needle. Anybody who's thinking what on earth is a self-threading needle, they are needles that you do not have to do the lick and stick thing. They have a little sort of a catch at the end and you just kind of push your thread into them. Very commonly used in quilting. My mum used to call them blind man's needles. How many blind people do you know that sew? I don't know many at all, for good reason. So that's one side of your pouch done. Your zipper is attached on one side. Zippers are something that terrify a lot of people, but there's no great mystery as long as you clip them well and fit them properly. Now, what I should have said when I laid that zipper on there is that the zipper pull was to my left, and that's because I'm right-handed and I want the pull to open left to right. If you're a left-handed person, when you lay that zipper on initially, you want the zipper on the right so that when it opens, it's opening as a left-handed direction. So let's just move my ironing pad because it's in the way. Let's take the back part of our bag, and we're going to do the same process again. So we're going to lay that zipper onto that panel right at the edge with 3/4 inch gap on either side. Now your exterior panel should match up at the sides, and that's a good indication that you've got it in exactly the right place. Clip it in place. And we're going to stitch it down using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. What's a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance? It's a bit less than a 1/4 inch. It's a very strange measurement, it has to be said, because it isn't, I don't think there is an actual measurement for scant. I think scant is just less than. A bit like my granny used to call modern underwear scanties, because there's scanty any fabric on those, she'd say. Not sure that's a proper word, but it's the same thing. So you're going all the way along. When you get to the point where the zipper pull is, again, you can lift up that top panel with your needle in, raise your foot, and you can move that zipper pull out of the way. Oops. You can trim off the excess zipper from the side. You're going to take your second lining piece and you're going to lay it right sides down, so the proper side down, so that you've made another zipper sandwich. So you'll see you're interfacing on the top. You're going to match up the top two corners. And either clip or pin in place. I generally don't use pins. Bag makers are not pin users, I think. Just going to do the zipper up so it's out of the way here. Let's change my foot. So a zipper foot or a narrow sewing foot, either works. So I usually tend to keep my ordinary foot on, but for some reason today it's not wanting to play. 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitching, just to secure my stitching. And for those of you that are worried about sewing over the zipper, if you're using a nylon coil zipper, your needle will just slip down between the teeth. There's no big drama about stitching over it. The only ones that I think can be a bit iffy are the big chunky ones, and certainly metal zippers. The metal zipper teeth, if you ever try sewing on one of those, you find out to your cost that it will cost you a needle, because the needles will break. It can also tend to throw the machine out if you hit a metal zipper. Right, I'm just to where the zipper pull is, so again I'm leaving my needle in, raising my foot, moving my zipper pull out of the way. Put back stitches at the end to secure my stitching, and again we're just going to trim just 1/8 of an inch from that exterior panel to remove just a little bit of the bulk from along the top there. It will make top stitching easier. If you use fusible fleece, you may not need to do this, because it's the foam that causes the issue. It just makes a bit of bulk along the top of your pouch. And if you leave too much bulk in, you won't be able to get your lining to sit flat inside, and it will catch in the zipper when you've made your pouch. There we go. Very pretty looking strip of foam with a little bit of fabric on it. Now we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to open out the lining panel and the exterior panel, and we're just going to push that lining panel down so that it's right behind the exterior. So if you want to press it, you can, but if you're going to press, then I would suggest you press from the lining side as opposed to the front side, because you will lose some of the sort of quilting puffiness that you get on the front if you do too much pressing on it. So that you can see it's all been clipped into place. Now putting my ordinary foot back on again. Bringing my bottom thread up so that I've got a long thread on the top and bottom, increasing my stitch length. And I top stitch at a 4. You can top stitch at whatever size of stitch you want, but I think 4 is a nice nice length for a top stitch. And I'm going to top stitch from the end of the zipper tab. I've got thread all over the place here, to where the zipper goes into in between the 2 layers. And again, I'm not going to back stitch at the beginning because I am going to be I'm just going to pull this zipper slightly out of the way though. I am going to be burying my threads in the same way as we did on the other side. I'm going to raise my foot, pull my zipper pull out of the way. Okay, we've got clips heading on the floor now. And it's for that reason I don't buy very expensive clips. I think it's Clover that make the original branded Wonder clips. These are from Amazon or AliExpress, one or the other. And they make exactly the same crunch when you stand on them as the Clover ones do, but cost a fraction of the price. So there we go, I've raised my foot, lifted my needle out of my work, and I'm just going to do exactly the same on this side as I did on the other, going back in through the last hole of stitching at both ends. Over and tying off. Now I'll show you in a second close up, but you'll notice that there's no gathered fabric at the top of my lining, and that's how I know that that where I've done that sort of rolling with my fingers, that I've actually got the lining exactly behind the exterior. If you haven't, what you'll end up with is a sort of an extra bit of fabric on the inside, and I'll show you in just a sec once I've tied these knots, else I shall forget that I need to tie them. And we'll have an unravelling pouch. So let's just bury those ends back into the gap between the lining and the exterior. Ooh. This burying of threads may seem like a bit of a faff. Anybody that's done a bag sew along with me will know that that's something I do all the time, and it becomes habitual after a while. But there's something really nice about a really well finished inside. So let me just, if I just do the zipper up, now you can see on the inside there that sits lovely and smooth on both sides of the zipper. If I haven't pushed that fabric down far enough and got the seam right on the top, you get kind of extra fabric on the inside, which kind of goes over the zipper teeth, and it will cause you problems. So if when you get to this stage, you look and you think, oh, I've got some fabric that's kind of gathered on the top here, it's really worth stopping, undoing your top stitching and pulling that fabric down so that you don't get any kind of gathering on the inside. So look at that. Doesn't that look super? So now we're going to, I'm just going to open the zipper because I don't need that shut at the moment. I'm going to take the 2 exterior pieces. So your lining pieces are out of the way. I'm going to match up those corners on the bottom there. stitch across the bottom of my bag, of my pouch, using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitches at the start and finish just to secure my stitching. Now, how fab does that look? What I'm now going to do is I am going to open up that seam at the bottom. So if I've got my bag like that, so that you can see that the zipper pull is at the top, well, it's nearest to me. I'm going to kind of flatten it out a bit. I'm going to open that seam underneath, and I'm going to top stitch. It's very difficult to press this because it's quite bulky. I'm going to top stitch either side of that bottom seam. I'm going to do that from kind of inside of the bag. Now, what I'll do is I basically will open up one end, and I'm going to go underneath with my other hand and open up that seam as I go. I kind of, once it's open, I kind of press it down onto the bed of my machine to keep it open. And I'm top stitching 1/8 of an inch away from that bottom seam. Just one stitch at the beginning to secure my stitching. This is thick, so do go slowly. Make sure you have a decent sized needle in your machine. And I'm just using universal needles here. Make sure your lining is out of the way. Your finger underneath just to open up the next bit of the seam. You should be able to feel where it's open. It'll feel bulky where it's not. So underneath, open up the seam. Make sure your linings are out of the way. And you're kind of almost stitching from inside of your pouch at this point. But remember, you're in charge. You can manipulate your pouch to do what you want it to do, rather than it doing what it wants to do. Make sure your lining's kept out of the way. And I keep saying that because on more than one occasion I've done this and managed to stitch my lining into this centre, this seam. So why do we do this top stitching? Because it helps to give a really nice base to your bag, and I'll show you the one that I didn't do top stitching on in a second, so you can kind of get an idea of why we do it. It isn't an essential, but it is, it just gives a better finish. So once I've done one side, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do the other side of that bottom seam. Again, 1/8 of an inch away from the joining seam. You have to kind of manipulate it a little bit to get to this other end, because your zipper pull and the tab will kind of be not in the way, because you can see I can move it right out of the way, but you just have to give it a little bit of a persuasion, shall we call it. Right, now you can see that that has stitched that seam open, and if I just turn it the right way out just for a second, and obviously it's not joined together, it's not all kind of made, but you can see that that's going to be the bottom of your bag, and it sits nice and flat. This one I didn't do that bottom seam, and you can see it sits, it's got a ridge in the bottom, it doesn't sit nice and flat. It makes a difference to the finished look. It is difficult to see actually because it's multicoloured, but this one is sitting beautifully flat and this one isn't. Difficult to see. It is optional though. So if you think, oh, I can't do that, that looks far too complicated, then just don't. It's really not worth the getting yourself upset about. Right, so having completely finished off that bottom seam, we are going to open up the lining and join, so that the two exterior panels are together and the two lining panels are together. We're going to match up those corners at the bottom of our exterior, making sure that they match perfectly. We're going to do the same on the other side. And then we're going to match the place where the exterior and the lining join. Now, what I will say is you need to make sure that the seams match perfectly. I open those two seams up, so the seam at the top where the zipper is, I'll open up, and the seam where the lining meets, I'll open up, and I will literally put a clip across those two pieces to make sure that they stay together. Then I will continue with my clipping all the way to the end of the lining. And that's all sitting nicely. My two seams there are open and matching. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side. So I'm just using my fingers to open up those seams where the two pieces join, making sure that they match perfectly. And then coming down, oh, run out of clips, onto the lining panels, and the two bottom corners of the lining panels also match perfectly. Now, if you're worried about your fabrics moving, what you can do is you can stitch across those joins first. What I will say is make sure that your zipper is open at this point, because if you don't, you're going to come a cropper in the end. And you're going to stitch, I'm going to just literally stitch over those side joins to make sure that they don't move, because they are inclined to on occasions. And I like to use an awl just to hold those seams together as I stitch over them. I'm stitching at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and having just stitched, I can then look and make sure I've got lots of bits of thread there where my quilting is left. You can just kind of make sure that they're still together and everything's hunky-dory. I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side, just over that seam in the middle. Again, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm just holding it in place with my awl. Yep, they're still perfectly matched. Right, now, oh, wrong end, wrong one. Now I'm going to stitch all the way down the side. I'm going to go back over that bit of stitching that I've already done. I'm going to start at the bottom corner. Stitching at the beginning. Now, if your machine doesn't like going over bulk, and this is a little bit bulky where we have this join, you could use a hump jumper if you feel you need to. My machine's pretty good at this, doesn't seem to bother too much. You're going to come down off of that thicker fabric onto the lining fabric. Now, that's why I tend to do from the thicker side to the thinner side, because my machine's happy to go that way. It doesn't like it so much if I go from the lining and then try to go onto the thicker, on the thicker side. I'm going to do exactly the same thing on the other side of the pouch. 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. stitching a little at the beginning and the end to secure my stitching. Now, on the bulk part of the exterior, you can trim down your seam allowance by about half, just on the exterior. Because you can't really press these open, you just want to take out a little bit of the bulk from the sides there. It just gets a bit, it tends to sit not very nicely at the sides. Right, my zipper is open, my lining is just kind of flapping in the wind. So I'm going to kind of put my hand in. You can see my fingers. And if I put my hand in and splay my fingers, you can see that that corner that we created, that square that we've cut out, suddenly becomes a boxed corner. And you can see it matches perfectly. What you want is for this open bottom seam and the side seam to match. Now, if you've got left enough fabric, open the side seam. If you haven't, don't worry too much about it. Make sure that those seams match though, that's really important. And then we're going to flatten it out. It'll all come back, don't worry. We're going to stitch across that bottom corner, again, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. 3/8 of an inch being 1 centimetre, 10 millimetres. For those of you that like to work in metric, I'm an inch girl. Go slowly over those central seams. It is bulky. And I'm going to do a second line of top stitching, of stitching, 1/8 of an inch below that original line of stitching, just for security. It also helps for the stitching not to show on the outside. Sometimes you see when people make boxed corners, and I see it quite a lot in Facebook groups, people say, why does my stitching show? And it's because you've got really thick, thicker fabrics and you've got several layers, and it just pulls the thread. Putting a second line of stitching tends to get rid of that problem. Right, once you've done that, you can trim off the excess seam allowance outside of your second line of stitching, and you can see that that looks really good. It's my bottom bottom part. Now if you want to, if you're like curious, and I'm always curious, turn out your corner and have a little look and go, whoa, how clever am I? Look at that. That seam, that central seam on the side goes right down and matches the central seam on the bottom. I've got a lovely flat base. Super, really happy with that. And we're just going to do exactly the same thing on the other corner. So I'm going to put my fingers in and kind of splay that open. Make sure that the side seam and the base seam are matched. Take what little bit of seam allowance I've got and open it. I've got a little bit of fabric there that's a surplus to requirements by the look of it. And you can see that's all clipped, and I'm going to do the same thing again as we did on the other side, a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Second line of stitching, 1/8 of an inch in from that line of stitching. So, sorry, on the outside, so the second line of stitching is towards the raw edge of the corner, not on the inside. And trim off the excess seam allowance. Again, you can turn it through and admire your handiwork. Thread there that doesn't need to be there. You can just kind of roll that corner between your fingers to make it that base corner. I've got bits of thread coming from all over the show here. Let's just trim those off. This is the only issue with Quilt As You Go, is that you have so many threads another nice square corner with the central seam and the side seam matching. All good in the hood. So now we have finished the exterior part, we're now going to look at our lining. And what we're going to do is we're going to match up the two bottom corners of our lining. So our bag is still inside out. So matching up the bottom corners, but you can see I've left quite a large gap between my clips, and that's because I'm not going to stitch all the way along the bottom. If you wanted to add a pocket to the inside of this and turn through a pocket, then you can do. I'm not doing that on any of these. There are plenty of YouTube videos, and I can pop a YouTube video up with how to do a zippered pocket, and you can kind of do that one yourself. But I've matched those two corners, this corner and this corner, and I've left a gap of approximately 4.5–5 inches in the middle, and I'm going to stitch along the bottom of the lining using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to leave that gap open. So back stitching at the beginning and the end. So I think you can probably see, I don't know, I've done it in cream, so it's probably not that visible actually, but I have a gap in the middle of the base of my bag. So I'm going to put my hand into that gap, and I'm going to use the exact same technique as we did before on the sides of my lining. So we're going to match the lining side and base. I'm going to open up that side seam, and I'm going to open up the base seam with my fingers. You can press them if you want to. I'm a bit of a naughty, I don't press my seams open as much as I should do. But I'm going to match those two seams. I will open that and press it before we actually turn the bag though, because it will look nicer if I do that. But I've matched those seams, and now I'm just going to stitch across the bottom of that corner, that boxed corner, again 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Ensuring that the open seams stay open. I'm not going to do a second line of stitching on that. I am just going to trim off the excess seam allowance, and I'm going to go in through the other side and do the same thing in the other lining corner. So opening up the seam allowance on the base and on the side, and flattening it and matching it so that the side seam and the base seam match. And then I'm just going to stitch across there again 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I kind of feel like I'm repeating myself. And this method, this technique applies to all of these pouches. The only thing I would say that is different is for the little one, I like to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance for all of it, because it is quite a little pouch. If you're taking off quite a large amount of the size of it by using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and because I'm using a number 3 zipper on that one, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance when I fix the zipper in. So the same technique will apply, but your seam allowance will change from the two bigger ones, from the large one and the short one will be 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and this tiny one will be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now we've got this. Not much to look at really, is it? We're going to go in through that hole that we left in the bottom of the lining, and we're just going to grab the exterior and bring it back through that hole in the lining. I'm not going to call it a hole because it isn't actually a hole. It's a turning gap, an aperture, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to put my fingers in and just going to push out those bottom corners on both ends. I'm going to pop my finger, not in the lining, but pop my finger in and push out that zipper tab. I'm going to do the same at the other end. Now, if you want to, you can pop a couple of stitches across here. I like to because it just holds that lining in place on that end, but it's a personal preference thing. So once you've got it all turned out the right way, pull out your lining again and just tuck the raw edges of that aperture that we left into the turning gap, matching up the sort of folded seams. And you've got two choices. You can either hand stitch that. Now, I don't hand stitch if I can get away with it, or you can run across that gap with your sewing machine at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is what I'm going to do. Just need to make sure that the folded edges stay together. If you're a hand stitcher, ladder stitch works really well for this because it just disappears. If you've chosen to put a zipper pocket in the bottom, then you could leave a gap in the bottom of your zipper pocket and turn through the gap. I'm just going to pop my lining back into my bag. Push it into the corners. And that is sitting perfectly. And it's just a really cool little, so I use it for pencil cases, use it for whatever you want to use it for. I am going to just stitch across there though, because that lining will annoy me. So I'm just going to stitch from where I finished my top stitch on one side to where I finished my top stitch on the other side. And I'm just going to, this can be quite thick, so it's not for everybody. Long threads, start and finish. I'm going to go in to the last hole I made. And then often you find you actually it's easier to hand crank over this because it is quite bulky. And I've literally finished in this stitch that so I started in at the end of this top stitching and I finished at the beginning of this top stitching, and I'm going to bury my threads the same way as I did before. I would if I could, there it is, if I could find the needle. So I'm taking it from the outside through to the inside. Tying off just with a couple of knots. And because we can't actually get to the inside of the lining now because we've actually sealed our lining up, you could do this before you seal your lining if you wanted to. Honestly, I kind of forgot. What I'm going to do is I've threaded my two ends on and I'm just going to pull my lining out away from the foam. I'm going to pop my needle into my lining, and then I'm going to have it come out again about an inch away. This isn't a particularly long needle, so I can't do it for much further than an inch. So it's gone in and out, and then trim off those ends, and you'll never know they were there. So going in to the lining, and then out of the lining. You can see both of those ends have come right the way through, and I'm just going to snip them as close to the lining as I can. And if you just kind of do that, those ends have disappeared into the lining, and that's no bother at all. So there we go, that pouch opens really wide. Perfect for pens, scissors. I've got a couple this size, and I think they look pretty cool because they're sort of a bit like a short fat dumpling. But they're great for all sorts because they've got a really nice wide bottom. So that's my first one, and you can see my design is all kind of going right the way round, and that holds a vast amount. So that's the short. I'm going to carry on and do the other two. The exact same method applies, so you're not going to be doing anything different other than changing the seam allowance, and obviously it's just a bit more slightly different shape. So we're going to change the seam allowance from for the tiny one down to 1/4 of an inch. There we go, one pouch. I'm going to do the other two and we'll have a full set.